So it's in this session that we're going to introduce the idea of biblical shadows. You spent some time in your lesson on those verses in Colossians and in Hebrews. In fact, the first two questions dealt with that. So let's just look at Colossians in a little more context. And I'm going to start up in verse 13, because leading into verses 16 and 17, 16 starts with a therefore, which means it's the concluding thought of something that came before it. So this is what comes before it. When you were dead in your transgressions, okay, so it's Paul talking to New Testament believers. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him. This is Christ that has done this. Having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he had taken it away, he took it out of the way, he nailed it to the cross. So the cross event has taken care of this debt, this canceled, it's a certificate of debt that's been canceled. Picture, by the way, of the year of Jubilee, right? Canceled debt, okay? So, when he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, what rulers and authorities are those? Well, you might be tempted to say the earthly rulers and authorities, and that may fit into some circumstances, but ultimately, who's the ruler and authority that Jesus conquered? Yeah, it's the adversary. It's the Satan character, okay, his adversary. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them. So, the battle's been won, in other words, in the precursor to verses 16 and 17. And then we get to verse 16. And it says, therefore, no one is to act as your judge. Because of Christ's victory in all this area, no one's to act as your judge, New Testament believer, in regard to this list of things. And what's in the list of things, without going through them in detail? Well, they're things out of the Old Testament law, right? They're regulations around what to eat and when to congregate and how to do that and all those regulations. And how does he refer to those? He says those things coming out of the Old Testament are a mere shadow of what is to come. But the substance belongs to Christ. So let's talk about shadows and substance a little bit. What are shadows? Well, I like to talk in terms of shadows are flat, one-dimensional, no color to them, representations of something that is not flat, right? It has dimensions, that is full, that has color and substance to it. So it's a flat representation of something else. Shadows sometimes reflect aspects of the substance. I would often say if I had my little Schnauzer dogs next to me and I was standing in the middle and it was a really sunny day with the sun behind me and you only saw our shadows, you would likely be able to tell. You might not be able to tell it's me exactly, right? But you'd likely be able to tell what? Just based on the shadows. Oh, there's a person there. And it looks like two small dogs next to a rather large person, right? So you can tell some things by the shadows, but you can't tell all the details of the substance that cast that shadow. That's what you should be able to do. And so taking a look at what Paul says here in Colossians and what the book of Hebrews said, we should be able to look back in the Old Testament and the ministry of those things that are mentioned, we should be able to see reflections or shadows, a vague outline that somewhat represents the ministry of the substance. And who's the substance? It's Jesus, okay? So, I'm going to introduce something now that might be new to some of you. There was a philosopher by the name of Plato. Do you remember hearing about Plato? It was that one class you had in college. It was probably the class you skipped. Plato wrote a book called The Republic. And he wrote it around 400 BC. It was around 380 BC. Okay, so this is before the time of Christ. And it largely continued a conversation that had started before him, but it largely shaped the conversation that came after him. And in that book, he discusses a world that he calls the world of forms. It's kind of a vague concept, but just a simple definition would be a form, the things that exist in this world of forms, are ideal versions of something, okay? So they exist in an unseen realm. They are the ideal version, and we don't have forms in the seen realm here on earth. What we have are shadows in the physical world of ideal things that are unseen. Does that make sense? He talked about these because people were thinking, the world, the thing I have in this world, that's the end all. And he's like, no, we see remnants of good here on earth. We see good as people display good, but is it really true ideal good when a person displays good? It might seem like it at times, but what's always underneath? There's always people looking out for their best interests, right? There's always a little bit of... So when we see good, let's say, on earth, we get a glimpse of it. We get a shadow of good. But what Plato says is somewhere in the unseen realm, the world of the forms, there is good. And it is unadulterated, ideal good. Okay? This all kind of culminates in an allegory that he gives. It's a very famous allegory. It's called the allegory of the cave. It's in book 7. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I want to give you a picture. There's a group of people fastened to chairs with their heads in vices so they can only look straight ahead, and they've been this way since they were born. And in front of them is the wall of a cave. Behind them is a fire. And between them and the fire, there are people passing by with objects. And the fire sheds its light on the object and casts a shadow on the cave wall in front of these people. But they don't have any concept of what's going on behind them because they've never been able to move. And all they get to see is what? On the wall. All they get to see is the shadows. And Plato says in this allegory of the cave that you would imagine eventually people in this condition would start to think that the shadows are something in and of themselves, that they would start to name them, they would start to look for characteristics of the shadows, they would come to think that the shadows are the substance, right? Does that make sense? It's an allegory that he uses on education, and it plays into this world of the forms, and he says, oftentimes we in the world look at things that we think are real things, and we want to make them into substance. But in reality, in his world, they're shadows. Well, that was around 380 BC. And there's several other people that followed him in conversations in the philosophic realm, in the secular philosophic realm. But it's into that situation that that Christ comes. It's into that situation philosophically that Christ comes. And it's interesting that some in the New Testament, some of the authors in the New Testament, borrow some of the language from philosophic thought to describe the truth of the God of the Bible. So it's not just the authors coming from a Jewish perspective. They do that, all the Old Testament stuff that they bring in, but they're also bringing in ideas from the philosophic realm, because who else besides the Jews need to accept this message of Jesus? Oh, it's the Gentiles, the people that have no history with the Jewish scriptures. So it's interesting that this gospel, Paul is very well versed in not just Jewish tradition and history, but very well educated in philosophic landscape as well in his day. So I'm kind of reminded, or when I think of it in those terms, and I read what Paul says in Colossians 2:16, 17, what the author of Hebrews says, and I approach the idea of rest, or this topic of rest, what I often think is that we as a church are kind of like those people in the cave sometimes, and we're looking at things that are shadows things that the Scripture has defined as shadows, right? And we kind of want them to be the end all. We kind of think that those things are the thing. They're the substance. And we're coming out of this lesson, if it wasn't clear to you going through the lesson, those things are not the end all. They're just, again, a reminder of something else. The shadow caster, and the shadow caster, the one standing up who has form and substance, that person is Jesus, right? So, I feel like that's where many of us are regarding the Sabbath. The church is arguing with one another over how to define and interpret the shadows of rest. And let me read something out of Plato's Republic. His discussion is a back and forth discussion between characters in his book, and one of them asks the questions, well, what would it be like in a world like that where people were, viced and only able to see one thing? He says this: groups of people would form, and they would begin to be governed by men who fight over shadows with one another. Now listen to this. They'd be governed by people who fight over shadows with one another and form factions for the sake of ruling, as though it were some great good in and of itself. When in reality, that's not the form of the good. In gospel terms, what's the form of the good? The true form. It's Jesus, right? Yeah. So, I feel like we do that with the Sabbath. I feel like the Sabbath has caused us to form factions within the body of believers. It's as if the shadow of the Sabbath is the substance. And that's where our conversation ends, oftentimes. And the longer that we, as a group of believers, choose to focus on the shadow and talk about the shadow and discuss the shadow and argue about the shadow, what are we not focusing on? We're not focusing, we're not even acknowledging really that there is a shadow caster, that this whole thing is about. And so if anything, coming out of tonight, what I'd like you to begin to get the perspective of is the whole of the New Testament presents Jesus as the thing. He's it. And everything before him was pointing to him. And if we're not talking about Jesus in terms of his ministry, in terms of what the shadows of the Old Testament showed us, if we're not talking about fulfillment in Jesus, I think we're missing the boat. And that's where the majority of us are in the church. So it's time to move on. Would you agree? Amen.